In this video, we're going to talk about the right to protest and when protesting turns into some sort of crime, particularly crime in the United States. And we'll talk a little bit about protesting crimes in Germany. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that protesting is a public way to exercise our human rights. And throughout history, protests have enabled individuals and groups to express dissent, opinions, and ideas, expose injustice and abuse, and demand accountability from those in power. And helping to shake up rigid and unaccountable power dynamics and structures, protesting has been a vehicle for advancing human rights for a very long time. And when we're describing protests, I want you to think of it as a universal term for many types of protests. That could be marching, that could be rallies, that could be pickets, sit-ins, civil disobedience. And we're going to get into some of the current ways that we've seen some protests of disruptions of public official meetings, even the climate bluer situation, where they're obstructing traffic. All of those at this point, we're going to put under the umbrella of protesting. The refusal to comply with certain laws as a peaceful form of political protest would be what we describe as civil disobedience. And protests are an important way for people to come together and create a forum for public debate and political engagement. Protests also create opportunities to advance and defend the rights of others and to foster rights, respecting societies. These strategies and tactics can be used to pave the way for progress in areas that impact our everyday lives, including better governance, safer working conditions, and combating issues like racism, discrimination, and environmental destruction. And in fact, Martin Luther King said this about civil disobedience. He said, just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could shake off the bondage of myths and half-truths and rise to the realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so we must see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. Protests are widespread and on the rise. And remember that the main reason is to disrupt. And if the whole point is to disrupt, we have to ask ourselves what disruption is acceptable. Now, in some circumstances, states have responded by cracking down on peaceful protesters. We've found undue restrictions on protests in ordinary and emergency legislation. We've seen the criminalization of protests, the unlawful use of force to disperse protesters and to intimidate and deter others from joining these mobilizations. And we've also seen new methods to deter protests, digital surveillance and shutting down internet and digital communication networks. Actually, Amnesty International created a map which visualizes the widespread human rights violations related to the policing of protests across the world. So we need protests to be protected. And then we have to take a look at that gray area to see what disruptions are considered acceptable and what should be criminalized. I would say that the right to protest is protected under international human rights law. And it's one which states have a duty to respect, protect, and facilitate. International human rights law protects the right to protest through a number of provisions enshrined in various international and regional treaties, which, taken together, provide protesters with comprehensive protection. The UN Human Rights Committee is called on states to ensure that they protect peaceful demonstrations whenever they take place, outdoors, indoors, online, in public and private spaces, or a combination thereof. Peaceful protests are a legitimate use of public space, And the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and Association has stipulated that the free flow of traffic should not automatically take precedence over freedom of peaceful assembly. Article 2 of paragraph 1 of the European Convention on Human Rights guarantees every person the right to assemble freely and peacefully with others. And as a rule, participants in peaceful protests should not face criminal sanctions. Any restrictions on the right to freedom of peaceful assembly are only permissible if they meet the three-part test. The first is legality. All restrictions imposed must be provided by a clearly defined law that allows people to regulate their conduct accordingly, that must itself be in compliance with the international human rights law and which may not be applied arbitrarily. 2, necessity and proportionality. Authorities must make sure that they use the least intrusive means possible, and the restriction must do more good than harm. 3, pursuance of a legitimate aim. Restrictions can only be imposed in the interest of national security or public safety, public order, for the protection of public health or morals, or for the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. The UN Human Rights Committee says that a peaceful assembly stands in contradistinction to one characterized by widespread and serious violence. Violence, in the context of the right to peaceful assembly, typically entails the use by participants of physical force against others that is likely to result in injury or death or serious damage to property. Mere pushing or shoving or the disruption of vehicular or pedestrian movement or daily activities do not amount to violence, according to the UN Human Rights Committee, General Comment 37, paragraph 15. For a protest to be considered outside the protection of the right to peaceful assembly, there must be compelling and demonstrable evidence of resorting to violence or to incitement of violence, hostility, or discrimination by a significant number of participants. Protesters who engage in acts of violence are not protected by the right to freedom of peaceful assembly, and consequently, the authorities could impose legitimate and proportionate sanctions. However, even those engaged in acts of violence maintain all their other rights, such as the rights to life, to security of person, to physical integrity, and to be free from torture and other ill treatment. Now I want to kind of switch a little bit and ask you what constitutes excessive use of force by police at protests. So now we're looking at police action. And in order to do that, I'd like to give you a little bit of a historical perspective. In the 1960s, we had in the United States what we called the escalated force model. Policing mass protests entailed showing dominant force early in order to deter criminality and civil disobedience, and it tended to inflame tensions and provoke violence by protesters rather than preventing it. What we then saw was that in the 1970s, the negotiated management model. Here, they started to shift, and police were trained to see their role as helping to facilitate First Amendment freedom of expression and communicating ahead of time what behaviors they would or would not tolerate, discussing that with community leaders. In the 1990s, unfortunately, we saw a shift back to the escalated force model. Police again began ratcheting up their responses to mass protests once again. There were violent clashes between police and protesters at the 1999 World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference in Seattle. And the Seattle police chief at the time, Norm Stamper, said his handling of that event was one of the worst mistakes of his career. He said, "We used chemical agents, a euphemism for tear gas, against non-violent and essentially non-threatening protesters. The natural consequence of which was that we were the catalyst for heightened tension and conflict rather than peacekeepers." The terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001 further reinforced this trend towards more aggressive police responses to mass demonstrations. Spearing large crowded events were prime targets for terrorist activities. And then we move closer towards the demonstrations that we saw in 2020. In a free society, protesting, these forms of popular criticism of the government, are essential, yet they present a challenge. Popular resistance can go too far, especially when it's violent. And police need discretion to manage those who would oppose them. Yet, where do we draw the line? And in 2020, it was the first time that we saw that the protests actually focused on protesting against the police. And that made them especially difficult to manage since the protests were about policing. In many jurisdictions, the police response to demonstrations really added to the anger and distrust towards the police that many demonstrators felt. Police didn't expect and were not prepared for the level and extent of violence that they encountered in many cities. Agitators threw Molotov cocktails and rocks at police, committed acts of arson, smashed windows and looted stores, and used peaceful demonstrators as cover to commit acts of violence. Now, the Police Executive Research Forum wrote a report in February 2022 rethinking the police response to mass demonstrations, and they made several recommendations. One, police should invite community leaders to participate in police meetings and training sessions about planning the police response to demonstrations. These meetings should discuss the police response to demonstrations as a general matter, as well as planning for particular demonstrations. The police can gain valuable input while also building trust and showing their communities that police share the same goals of facilitating the peaceful exercise of First Amendment freedom of expression rights. Two, police should build trust during demonstrations by inviting community leaders who have strong credibility among the general public to serve as observers and partners on the streets. Police should work with these individuals to identify specific roles they can take to be helpful. Community leaders might use their cell phones to tell police that small numbers of people are arriving at certain locations with rocks or other objects to throw at officers, or spread the word among demonstrators that police want to clear one side of the street in order to allow any emergency vehicles to pass. And number three, police should really rethink their approach to use of force during demonstrations. Tear gas, pepper spray, beanbag rounds, rubber bullets, flashbang devices, other tools were being used in many cities that they hadn't used in years, and the police hadn't received special training on their use. So these were things that kind of were brought up after these demonstrations in 2020. Now, another thing that I'd like for us to kind of point out as we're discussing this, particularly what came out of evaluating these demonstrations, was this RDFC interaction model for police. And it's asking police officers, when they are monitoring protests, to first be reasonable, restrict the fewest restrictions and freedoms possible. Disarming, limit your use of force, coercion, and intrusiveness. Be focused, target only harmful behaviors and conditions. And lastly, be consistent. Deploy dependable and unbiased tactics, and provide proper training for police beforehand. So now we're going to shift, and we're going to start to look at some of the crimes that we find on the books as it relates to protesting. And the question I'd like for you to ask yourselves is, what constitutes overly restricted legislation that unlawfully restricts the rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association? Essentially, when does a protest become a crime? I'm going to use one particular example here for us to kind of explore. This is a criminal law, disorderly conduct or disrupting a meeting or procession in Tennessee, the state of Tennessee, 39-17-306. And the crime is if, with the intent to prevent or disrupt a lawful meeting, procession, or gathering, the person substantially obstructs or interferes with the meeting, procession, or gathering by physical action or verbal utterance. Now, in this scenario, this occurred in February of 2021. Some 30 to 40 people had filed into the back of the large assembly room in Knoxville's city-county building and then raised their fists at 6:30 p.m. during a Knox County Commission meeting. Although most remained silent, some called for the release of body cam footage from a shooting that had taken place at local high school, Austin East Magnet High School, that resulted in the death of a student, Anthony J. Thompson Jr. The police almost immediately disrupted their protest, physically pulling them out of the meeting. And actually 7 demonstrators were arrested. The 7 were accused of violating the signs that you saw at the beginning here, posted at all the entrances and on the large assembly doors. Outside the meeting, while they were being arrested, the 7 inside, the protesters chanted, "No justice, no peace, release the tapes." And "No justice, no peace, no racist police." Here is one of the videos taken at the time of the protest. Let me go ahead and make sure you can get our sound.
Knox County County Commission, your meeting is over. And what we got that's already is that we got a kid who was murdered in Knox County school. That was very young, like these children, no concern, they have their rights and other federal. It is not okay what you all are doing. A child was murdered by the very people who got their hands on me. Take your hands off of me. I have not broken any law. I am exercising my right to peacefully assemble and use the freedom of speech. You fucking murderers! You murderers! Y'all are murderers! Arrest me! Let's go. Let's go. Justice is not taking place in this city. We have a justice mandate and a man of faith who preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. There is no separation between our faith and our justice work. As a man of the gospel of Jesus Christ, I stand in the liberty that all people.
So what you can see from this video is, and it actually makes you want to revisit the question that I asked earlier. When does a protest become a crime? And from what you see, have these protesters in fact violated this criminal statute, disrupting a meeting? Tom Ruggles, one of the demonstrators, said that he came to the commission meeting because the community deserves to know what happened at the high school. He said, "Our message is release their tapes, release the tapes to the families so we can have the tapes to the public. And we want long-lasting changes to the police. The message from me is we need less money going to the police and more money going to alternatives." Based upon this protest, do you believe that this is overly restricted legislation that unlawfully restricts the rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association? One of the things I'll also point out is that there are very few defenses that are successful in cases in which protesters that have been criminally charged can then use as an affirmative defense. I will point out that there is an affirmative defense called necessity. And necessity essentially is that a violation of the letter of the law is justifiable if believed to be necessary to avoid harm to the actor or another, provided that the harm avoided is greater than the harm caused. So the defense can use this justification and say that the response, meaning the protest and what they did during, for example, this county commissioner meeting, was necessary and proportionate. At common law, the necessity defense had typically 6 different factors. The criminal offense with which the actor is charged was committed to avoid a significant evil. So it's kind of a lesser of evil offense defense. The actor reasonably believed that his or her actions were necessary and designed to avoid the significant harm. The actor had no alternative means of avoiding the threatened harm. The actor was without fault in bringing about the situation, calling for the choice of evils. The harm which the actor sought to avoid is greater than the harm reasonably expected to be created by the criminal offense committed. And 6, the legislature has not made a statutory predetermination of values for the situation confronting the actor. And the reason why I've highlighted to you factor 3 and factor 6 is that this is the reason why many times protesters do not have the option when they're charged criminally to use the necessity defense, because the argument is that the actor does have an alternative means of avoiding the threatened harm. And they could have done something else if they wanted the body cam footage that was different than what they chose to do by disrupting the meeting. And we also see here that the legislator does, in a way, create a statutory predetermination of values, because the legislature is the one that passed that criminal statute criminalizing disrupting a government meeting. You see, when you compare this to what's happening in Germany, a very similar situation at the time. There are a lot of students in particular that have been protesting climate change. And what you see here is a German law, Section 240 coercion. Whoever unlawfully by force or threat of serious harm compels a person to do, acquiesce to, or refrain from an act incurs a penalty of imprisonment. So a lot are being charged with coercion or blockading a road. And here was a situation in Germany where they had actually glued themselves to the road. If you look in Germany, they have a similar defense, such as the necessity defense. Here we have the basic laws as to the right of resistance. Germans shall have the right to resist any person. And the Germans have the right to assemble peacefully. And then we see the same necessity defense that we discussed in the United States, this lesser of two evils idea of someone who is faced with an imminent danger to life, limb, freedom, honor, property, or other legal interest, commits an act to avert the danger from himself or others. Again, but this is a very difficult defense to get the judge to approve, to be able to successfully defend yourself in these situations. The question for you to answer is, when do these actions that occur during a protest become a crime? Here's one scenario, another climate issue that occurred in during the tennis tournament when Coco Gauff was playing. How far, where is the gray area, and how far should we go? We see in this clip, this was another situation. The last one was in New York, during the US Open. Here's one in which a protester glued themselves to the airport runway.
Air passengers in Germany suffered lengthy delays on Thursday after climate protesters broke into two of the country's major airports. Members of the Last Generation activist group cut through security fences in Hamburg and Dusseldorf before gluing themselves to the runway. Dozens of flights were cancelled and some arrivals were diverted to other airports. The group accuses the German government of failing to tackle the climate crisis. Germany's transport minister condemned the protests as criminal activity.
So you can see how there is a gray area here, and it's tough for prosecutors to decide when it's appropriate to prosecute, whether the crime applies, and what the potential defense might be. Here we have a scenario where climate protesters actually defaced some artwork at a museum. And what we see here is that many times, if the necessity defense is even allowed during the criminal prosecution, it's unlikely to succeed. In looking over the last several decades, it was difficult to find cases in the US and other countries where the necessity defense, first of all, was allowed, because many times it's not even permitted. But when it is permitted, many times you will find a conviction. Did find some scenarios in Switzerland, one in France, and the United Kingdom, where the necessity defense was allowed, and it did allow for an acquittal. But again, I think what we need to understand as we're looking back on the history of protesting as an international human right, looking at the criminalization of protests, we have to understand that we have had a very long history of protests, and protests serve a very important purpose. And more importantly, it's important for us as lawyers to understand that we are leaders and leaders of our communities. And the point behind protests is that they want to have that type of media coverage. They want to pressure politicians to listen and hear their voice. They want to change the heart and minds of the population to their cause. So protests, as it stands, are going to be disruptive. Where that gray area is when we've moved from an action that turns from peaceful protest to a crime is something that prosecutors are going to have to evaluate, and defense attorneys are going to have to be prepared to defend. Lastly, any little piece of advice that you could give your client before they decide to protest. Prepare, if they do decide to protest, to encounter police, to be arrested and potentially held for 24 hours until their arraignment or post bail. Again, this is advice I would just be giving here in the United States. But protesters need to understand the risks and understand their rights, basic human rights, as well as the rights in their country where they are protesting. And we need to make sure we can advise clients that they can be legally filmed by the police and they can film themselves, but they should do it from a safe distance. They need to be careful not to physically interfere with what's happening. If they decide to move from a peaceful protest to more severe actions, there is a chance that that could be criminalized. Check with the attorney before posting any online photos or videos that they take during a protest, as they might contain sensitive legal information. And you will want to make every effort to find out where your client is being held if they are arrested after a protest, and call to immediately invoke their right to counsel. Clients need to make sure that they stay in touch with you as you are trying to protect their rights as well. Hopefully this video gave you a good overview of the challenges of protesting, the criminalization of protests, and how to defend when there is a protest.